Chapter 56. Now, here is something curious. The Reverend produces and makes available to the company his facsimile of Pennsylvania's fair copy of the field journals of Mason and Dixon, copied without the touch of human hands by an ingenious Jesuit device and printed by Mr. Wimbrel, next to the Seneca Maiden, Philadelphia, 1776. Cycles, or if you like, segments of 11 days, recur again and again here in 1766. 11 days after setting out southward from Brandywine as Mason paused at Williamsburg, the southernmost point of his journey. Next day he leaves for Annapolis, and 11 days later departs that city to return to work upon the line. A very pendulum. In April, just after crossing the North Mountain, they must wait in the snow and rain from the 6th through the 16th before resuming. The culminating pause, of course, is at the line's end, between 9 October of 67, when the chief of the Indians that were with them said he would proceed no further west than the Warrior Path, and the 20th, when the party, turning their backs for the last time upon the west, began to open the vista eastward unto their last days in America. Turning the pages, from 27 August of 68, when accounts were settled and the work was officially over and done with, till 7 September, their last night in Philadelphia, before leaving to catch the Halifax packet at New York. Again and again, this same rough interval continues to appear, suggesting a hidden root common to all. And friends, I believe 'tis none but the famous 11 missing days of the calendar reform of 52. Cries of "Cousin, we beseech thee," and "Poe, sir." Those of us born before that fateful September, observes the Reverend, make up a generation in all British history uniquely insulted, each life carrying a chronologic wound from the same parliamentary stroke. Perhaps we are compelled, even unknowingly, to seek these undecamerous sequences as areas of refuge that may allow us, if only for a moment, to pretend life undamaged again. We think of our time being held in whatever time's equivalent to a place is, like Eurydice, somehow to be redeemed. Perhaps, as our Indian brothers might, reenact some ancient adventure, correct in all details, so British of a certain age seek but to redeem 11 days of pure blank duration as unalienably their own. Pull not such faces, young Ethelma. One day, should you keep clear of fate for that long, you may find yourself recalling some injustice shared with lads and lasses of your own day, just as uncalmable and even yet unredeemed. Mason, for a while, had presumed it but a matter of confusing dates, which are names, with days, which are real things. Yet for anyone he met born before 52 and alive after it, the missing 11 days arose again and again in conversation, sooner or later characterized as brute absence or a tear through the fabric of life. And the more he wrestled with the question, the more the advantage shifted toward a belief, as he would tell Dixon one day. In a slowly rotating loop, or if you like, vortex, of 11 days, tangent to the linear path of what we imagine as ordinary time, but excluded from it, and repeating itself without end. The same 11 days, over and over, is what they're saying. You show, I add, an unusual grasp of the matter. Why then, as it is a periodic rotation, so must it carry, mustn't it, a vis centrifuga, that might, with some ingenuity, be detected. Perhaps by finding in the realm of time, where the loop tries either to increase or decrease its circumference, and hence the apparent length of each day in it, or yet again not rotate at all, the length of the day then continuing the same. Dixon, everything rotates. A vorticist! Lord help us! His mercy how infrequent. Emerson, believing vorticists to be the very legion of mischief, had so instructed every defenceless young mind he might teach. Very well, if you must know, lean closer and mark me. I have been there, sir. There, sir. Mason is gesturing vigorously with his thumb at the eye, much wider than its partner, that he uses for observation. Though I've ever tried not to recollect any more than I must, at least not till a zealously inquisitive partner insists upon knowing, yet the fact is that at midnight of September 2nd in the unforgiven year of 52, I myself did stumble, dazed and unprepared, into that very whirlpool in time, finding myself in September 3rd, 1752, a date that for the rest of England did not exist. Tempus incognitus. Don't say it. I didn't believe it myself, not until it happened. That is, no discomfort to it, only a little light-headedness at the stroke of the hour. Whilst I continued into the third, there came an instant transhalation of souls, leaving a great human vacuum, as everyone else moved on to the 14th of September. Not sure what that means, of course. You'd have felt it as a lapse of consciousness, perhaps, yet soon enough I discovered how alone 'twas possible to be, in the silence that flowed, no louder than wind, from the valleys and across those hill villages, where, instead of populations, there now lay but the mute effects of their lives, ash-whitened embers that yet gave heat, food left over from the last meals of September 2nd, public clocks frozen for good at midnight between the 2nd and the day after, though somewhere else in the world which had jumped ahead to the 14th, they continued to tick onward, to be rewound, to run fast or slow, carrying on with the ever-problematic lives of the clocks. Alone in the material world, Dixon, with 11 days to myself, what would you have done? Had a look in the Jolly Pitman, perhaps? A look of forbearance. Aye, as my first thoughts were of the George and Stroud, yet 'twas the absence of company that most preoccupied me. Seeking which, in some desperation, before the sun rose, I set out, reasoning that if I had been so envorticed, why so might others. Breaking off abruptly, a word or two shy, Dixon by now feels certain of some fatal confidence that Rebecca would have stood at the heart of. Young Charles was to reason eventually that the pain of separation had laid all upon his side, for she was to bid him good morrow upon the 14th, as she had good night upon the 2nd, without a seam or a lurch, appearing to have no idea he had been away cycling through 11 days without her, nor had whatever he lived through in that loop caused any perceptible change in the youth she kissed hello the very next day in the High Street in Stroud, brazen as a bell. Meanwhile, there he was, alone, with the better part of a fortnight before he'd be hooking up again with his betrothed, as smoothly as if he'd never been gone. And damn, he would be off. Were there yet horses about? Dixon wishes to know. Animals whose owners knew them made the transition along with them to the 14th. Most all the dogs, for example, fewer cats but plenty nonetheless. Any that remained by the 3rd of September were wild creatures or strayed into the valley, perhaps being ownerless, disconnected as well from calendars. I found one such horse, a horse no one would have known, as well as 2 cows unmilked and at large. I rode past miles of crops untended, looms stilled and water wheels turning to no avail. Apples nearly ripe, wagons half laded, the weld not yet abloom, nor the woad mills a stink, till at length, from the last ridge-line, there lay crystalline Oxford, as finely etched as my eyes, better in those days could detect, nor holding a thread of smoke in it anywhere. You were making for Oxford? Aye, with some cracked notion I'd find Bradley there, being a young Bradley-olator, as were all Len's fellows of that day, especially round Gloucestershire, though later, in my melancholy, I might see more vividly his all too earthly connections with Macclesfield and Chesterfield, and beyond them, looming in the mephitic stench, Newcastle and Mr. Pelham. At that moment, in my innocence, I believed that Bradley, our latter-day Newton, insatiately curious, must have calculated his way into this vortex, with the annoying question of why he should, kept beyond the gates of conscious entertainment. Did you find him there? I found something, not sure what. What surprised me was the sensible residue of sin that haunted the place, of a gravity withal, unconfronted, unatoned for, lying further than simple Jacobite persistence. I'd of course collected in some dim way that Bradley had advised Macclesfield, his great benefactor after all, perhaps even in partial return upon my lord's investment, as to ways of finding the movable feasts and holy days and so forth under the new style, and that Macclesfield had taken credit for the philosophical labour as Chesterfield for the witticisms and bonhomie that it took eventually to bring the Calendar Act into law. Yet, though Bradley seldom sought acclaim, preferring to earn it, neither would he refuse credit due him, unless there were reasons to keep silence, such as the unexpected depth of his complicity in an enterprise so passionately feared and hated by most of the people. Both reached for the coffee at the same time, Dixon elaborately deferring to Mason's overriding need for any anti-stupefacient to hand. I don't know that in the entire cycle I caught a wink of slumber. 'Twere but a devourer of precious time, when all of the knowledge of world civilized and pagan, late and ancient, lay open to my questions. Yet I guess I know this tale. 'Tis the German fellow, Faust, isn't it? But that he, at least, was able to live in the plenary world, I, alas, was alone. Well, as it turned out, not alone, exactly. I knew it! Some milkmaid out in a tryst, eh? Am I near it? Strayed too close to the vortex, whoosh, pale inverted skirts a-flying. So, how'd it go? Pray you, 'twas something I never saw. Certainly not Mr. Bodley's librarian, Mr. Wilde, and they were more than one. After nightfall, as I burned taper upon taper, wantonly, only just succeeding in pushing back the gloom about me, would I hear them rustling, ever beyond the circle of light, as if foraging among the same ancient leaves as I. Mice or rats, maybe. Too deliberate, they seemed to wish to communicate. And this was down among those secret shelves where none but the elect may penetrate. You know about that? Of course. Emerson gave us a brief inventory. Aristotle on comedy, always wanted to read that. All the good bits that Thomas left out of the infancy gospel. Shakespeare's tragedy of Hypatia. What saved me, impassively on, was hunger, an abrupt passage of indecipherable Latin, returning my attention at last from lighted page to empty stomach. I recalled that pantries and wine cellars all over the town lay open to my hungers. Apprehensive, light-headed, I rushed from the library, too a-tremble to keep a taper lit, up ladders creaking in the absolute dark, down corridors of high bookshelves. Presences lay everywhere in ambuscado. I dared not lift my eyes to what all too palpably waited, poised upon the ancient ceilings, winged, fatal. Then a sudden great whir at my face, scientifically no doubt a bat, though at the moment something far less readily named, provoking a cry of fear, as at last I broke out into the open air of a quadrangle, yellow in the moonlight. Wait, that's it, the moon! Indeed, among any amateur astronomer's first questions, how should the moon behave, seen from inside this vortex? And, ever full, ever fixed upon the meridian. An insincere chuckle. Yes, 11 days of light remorseless, to be faced alone in a city of Gothical structures that might or might not be inhabited, whilst from all directions came flights of the dark creatures I hoped were only bats. Thou don't mean, as the timbres, nearly human, of the ceaseless howling I hoped came only from dogs. Not? Oh, and more. 'Twas as if this metropolis of British reason had been abandoned to the occupancy of all that reason would deny. malevolent shapes flowing in the streets, lanterns spontaneously going out, men roaring as if changed to beasts in the dark. A carnival of fear. Shall I admit it? I thrilled. I felt that if I ran fast enough, I could gain altitude and fly. I would become one of them. I could hide beneath eaves as well as any. I could creep in the shadows. I could belong to the devil. Anything inside this vortex was possible. I could shriek inside churches. I could smash every window in a street, make a druidic bonfire of the Bodleian. At some point, however, without human prey, the evil appetite must fail, and I became merely melancholy again. Thee abandoned thy studies of the ancient secrets for a mere tickling of thy sensorium, done with how swiftly, Mason, dear Mason. In fact, Mason unmirthfully, I was prevented from ever returning, exiled from the knowledge. As I crossed into the courtyard before Duke Humphreys, I encountered a barrier invisible, which I understood I might cross if I willed, though at the toll of such spiritual unease that one step past it was already too far. What that influence was, I cannot say. Perhaps an artifact of the vortex, perhaps an infestation of certain beings invisible. I received, though did not altogether hear, from somewhere a distinct message that the keys and seals of Gnosis within were too dangerous for me, that I must hold out for the promises of Holy Scripture and forget about the texts I imagined I had seen. I didn't want to hear that, I guess. Mason seizes, cradles, and hefts his abdominal spheroid. Meditating upon bodily resurrection, I arrived at the idea of this being resurrected, and without delay proceeded to a Bacchic interlude, in which you'd not be interested, being too prolonged, and besides, too personal. Well, now, gone was the chance that might have changed my life. It lay at the eye of that vortex. To cross the flow of time surrounding it, was I obliged to aim a bit upstream or toward the past, in order to maintain a radial course to the centre. And there, whilst with Taurian stubbornness thou kept at it? Well now, odd as it may seem, soon as I'd penetrated the barrier, I understood my holiday was over. I tried to pull back, but too late. I was in the vertical emprise. To my relief, some, at least, of the dark presences that had caused me such apprehension proved to be the wraiths of those who had moved ahead instantly to the 14th, haunting me not from the past, but from the future, drawing closer, ever closer, until first I heard the voices of the town, then at the edges of my vision blurs appeared and movement, which went suddenly a-whirl, streaking in to surround me, as in the mesh of prolonged faces. Only hers stood firm. And when I joined her again, before I could think of what to say, she kissed me and declared, "Somebody got in late last night." The only proof I had that 'twas not a dream was the bite I received whilst in my noctambulation of the city. This life, runs the moral he is able by now to draw for Dixon, is like the 11 days, a finite period at whose end she and I, having separated for a while, will be together again. Meanwhile must I travel alone, in a world as unreal as those empty September dates were to me then. Bite, Mason? Nothing. Likely a dog. How likely? What else? If the people of Stroud, pursuing ordinary lives 11 days ahead of me, could more foes to such sinister beings, why not their dogs? Show me. Well, that was the rum thing, Dixon. For about 10 minutes later, I am the sniffer sniffed, as Parker said when he put his head in the beer's den. End of chapter.